At one of my congregation's men's lunch groups this past week, the topic of year-end performance appraisals came up. This particular men's lunch group is made up of men who are not yet retired, and I deduced from what they were sharing that the month of November brings with it a certain anxiety. Before the end of the year bonuses are decided and before raises are figured out, each of them is going to have to sit down and have some type of reckoning with their teams of employees. One gentleman shared that one of his primary anxieties came from trying to figure out how to phrase and frame his evaluations of employees when the decision about that employee's raise had already been made by people higher up in the organization. How do you break the news to someone that they will only be receiving a slight raise when they've clearly been getting wonderful reviews from you all year long? And perhaps even more challenging, how do you explain an overly generous raise to someone who hasn't quite exceeded expectations? In the professional church world, the year ends with a congregational meeting, then Advent and Christmas, a mad scramble to plan and decorate, print extra bulletins, learn more music, write more sermons. In the business world, there are reviews and appraisals. I'm going to stick with my end of the year. It's the appraisal of all things that is on Jesus' mind as he approaches his final days in Jerusalem. Perhaps sensing his own days might be numbered at that point, he sits down with his disciples and wants to talk to them about it and let them know that there will be some kind of reckoning. The Son of Man will return. I find that not much of modern-day Christianity likes to touch on this aspect very much. Unfortunately, we have tended to leave talk about the end of time and things like the judging of the living and the dead to Hollywood. Maybe it's because we feel it doesn't fit our overly scientific worldview. Maybe it's because deep down it brings fear. Regardless, one of the topics that Jesus brings up with a good deal of regularity during the time with his disciples is his return at the end of the ages to claim his kingdom of righteousness in full. To take Jesus seriously means taking to heart what he says about the future. What he says this morning about the future is often called the parable of the talents. And I don't know if it's just a sign of the influence of the times it's having on me, but doesn't this read like an episode of The Apprentice? A man plans to go on a long trip, but before he leaves, he decides to leave his slaves in charge of everything. He gives each of them a different portion of the estate, kind of like when you go on vacation for a while. And you hire one person to take care of the yard, but find a neighborhood kid to come in and water your plants and feed the cat. Talents were a way of grouping money in the ancient world, and it is estimated that one talent was worth about 20 years' wages. So to the first slave, the man gives control of about 100 years of wages. The second slave gets the equivalent of 40 years' wages, and the last slave about a year's worth. So in the end, this isn't just like leaving the neighborhood kid in charge of the plants and cat food. These are vast sums of money, and with them comes vast responsibility and authority. Jesus says the man entrusts the slaves with it. One translation says he handed over his property to them, which means it's implied they are supposed to do something with it. In fact, it sounds like they're supposed to do with the man's property whatever he would have done with it while he's away. So off they go. We learn the one who is given 100 years' wages uses it to develop a cool new technology that enables people to carry around little computerized phone cameras in their pockets. Pretty soon, everyone in the world buys one and uses them primarily to share photos of what they're eating, and to get into political arguments with each other. He doubles the money that was given to him. The second slave decides to go the food route and uses the 40 years of wages given to him to start a company of really fancy stores that will serve just coffee. And he imagines people will be willing to spend over $2 for 1 cup of coffee, even if they get it in a paper cup. People think he's silly and that he's just throwing his master's money away. But look who's laughing now. Can we say $8 pumpkin spice latte? He too doubles his money in no time. The third guy is nervous about this whole responsibility thing. He knows better than to go risking his master's money on anything. And he's definitely not going to spend a dime of it on something as frivolous as a smartphone or an overpriced cup of coffee. So he figures the best thing to do is just find a shoebox, put the money in there, and shove it under his bed until the master comes back. Well, it takes a really long time for the master to come back. The amount of time is never the issue, and the slaves are not told to figure out secret codes or read the Bible a certain way to predict his return. The point is that there is some sort of performance appraisals when he does. The first 2 slaves are rewarded. How does the master phrase his evaluation? You will be entrusted with even more responsibility and property. More than that, they receive the joy of their master. The third guy, not so much. And as it turns out, the master is not all that worried about how he spends this appraisal. Wicked, lazy, and worthless is what he gets called in no uncertain terms. And then the master looks at him across the boardroom table and says, "You're fired." The real matter, of course, is that the third slave misjudged his responsibility because of a fundamental misunderstanding about the master. The slave lived in fear. For whatever reason, he thought his master was harsh, unscrupulous, although it's hard to know why a man who left slaves in charge of so much could ever be thought of as harsh. The master is generous and giving, willing to take enormous risks. And so if the slaves are to follow the master's lead, then they too should be willing to risk, to see time not as something to be endured, passed through, but as potential for growing, changing, learning. To tend his gifts, to safeguard them, means to use them even if you're not really sure where it might take you. This is Jesus' lesson about the future for his disciples. In the time when they're waiting for his return, they should be working, serving, taking risks. Sharing the gifts of God has given wisely, but generously, is precisely what our Heavenly Father intends for us to do. Preserving and protecting our lives, keeping everything as is simply because that's how we've received it, is not our mission as disciples. And neither is focusing too much on the amount of talent or treasure we have received. For this parable is not really about money at all. It's about the whole of our lives, our heart, our joy. As one famous English clergyman from the 1800s once said, "The greatest of all mistakes is to do nothing because you can only do a little. Do what you can." Putting ourselves and our unique constellation of gifts out into the world, into the service of our neighbor, is precisely what we're called to do as Jesus followers. And the thought we could somehow ever lose what God has given us is a lie the devil tells. Risk is a part of the kingdom's strategy. Risk is factored into the whole shooting match, right from that first moment by the fishing boats in Galilee to the church capital campaign. Look at the risk God himself takes by sending Jesus. On the cross, God goes all in for us, lays it all out there, investing everything God has for the sake of you and me. And even though it looks like Jesus loses it all, even though it looks for a moment or two that his decision to live for God's kingdom and not Caesar's was terribly unwise, he doesn't. On the third day, he rises, promising to us all the joy of his master. This is not harsh at all. This is grace for you and for me. One of my favorite things to do each week is to read the obituary in The Economist magazine. I find it inspiring and fascinating to find out how different people around the world have invested or shared their lives. And the writing of the obituary editor, Ann Rowe, is brilliant, impeccable. She chooses one person each week who has recently died and attempts to capture the essence of their life and their contributions to humankind in 1,000 words. Only about a quarter of the time do I recognize the subject of her obituary. The other 3/4 are people I only learn about for the first time as I'm hearing of their death. For example, one of her recent obituaries was of Joseph Schmidt, a humble man from rural southern Illinois who ended up doing all the maintenance on NASA's spacesuits, from Chuck Yeager to Alan Shepard to John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, and the first of the space shuttle crews. The unpretentiousness with which he shared his formidable gifts was amazing. The obituary she wrote for Fats Domino was also enlightening. Some of the lives she shares are more tragic than others, of course, but most seem to contain at least somewhere an element of a life that was not buried in the ground. Moved by her talent at writing, I wrote her a card a while back to express my adulation and my thanks. To my surprise, Ms. Rowe sent me a handwritten note back on Economist letterhead. The only fan mail I'd ever sent in my life at that point was to a person who writes death notices. In any case, I found the words of her note even more enlightening. She wrote, "How very kind of you to write. I'm delighted that you enjoy the obits. They are a great pleasure to write and fill me with wonder at the sheer variety and ingenuity of human beings. I hope, too, that they may make a small appeal to incorporate death into life, to embrace it, and to celebrate, as I deeply believe, that the spirit cannot possibly decay with the body, but moves on to even more extraordinary adventures." Unfortunately, she continues, Western society finds it so hard to face death that we cannot even find advertisers to go on the page opposite mine. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all our years away, goes the well-known hymn, O God, our help in ages past. Ann Rowe preached me a sermon. Do we approach the suspense of our death, or of Jesus' second coming, whichever comes first, with a sense of fear and foreboding, that we can put it off indefinitely, that we can stop the ever-rolling stream? Or do we approach the suspense of our deaths and Jesus' return with the sense of duty to grow and share and serve the world with joy? Can we incorporate death into life, the final appraisal into each daily task? It seems that's what Jesus is up to, in fact, passing around the cup and the loaf on the night he was betrayed, weeping at the tomb of Lazarus before he calls him forth to life, offering forgiveness and compassion even as he hangs there dying. We incorporate our own death to sin that happens in baptism into life for the world around us. Therefore, Called forth by this Master, let us do with our talents what God himself would do with them if he were the one waiting. Let's live as the bold advertisements that can go on the opposite page to death. Advertisement that says loud and clear with each breath that what is given by God is greater and more generous than we could ever imagine. That say with each day that what is given by God can never be truly lost, but only goes on to more extraordinary adventures. Thanks be to God.